Christianity makes a claim that to the natural mind seems absurd. Jesus rose from the dead. This claim is mocked by atheists and skeptics like these.
Jesus of Nazareth did not rise from the dead. People don't rise from the dead after being dead for 3 days.
Specifically, how I think Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Bereavement hallucinations are very, very common.
The resurrection of Jesus 3 days after he was crucified is a proven event in history. Citation needed. And no, the Bible claiming it is not evidence.
Outside of the Christian Bible, there are no accounts of Jesus' resurrection. People seeking the truth should really be investigating this normalized fantasy.
Most argue that there is just no evidence for the resurrection and that people just don't raise from the dead. And I thought it was time to address the claim that there's no evidence for the resurrection head on and expose that statement as false. Let's go. We've got a lot to get into, so let's just jump right into it. First, I need to explain the difference between proof and evidence. Proof is something that applies to non-empirical concepts only, so things such as math and logic. So for example, in math, there's this theorem called the Pythagorean theorem related to right triangles, and it basically says that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. But how do I actually know that to be true? You see, I could have all the evidence in the world. I could measure 100 triangles, 500 triangles, 5,000 triangles. I could measure 6 million triangles. And it doesn't matter how many triangles I measure, it would never be proof that the very next triangle is going to measure the exact same way. But in math, you can use logical processes and means to prove that a squared plus b squared equals c squared without ever measuring a single triangle. You can see one such proof right here. And don't worry, I'm not going to go through it because this isn't a math class. But basically, this proof shows logically that the Pythagorean theorem is true, and it must be true, without the need of measuring infinite number of right triangles. And this type of proof is what some people think of when they think of science and history. But when people speak of scientific proof or historical proof, it's really coming from a misunderstanding. Science and history, they don't actually deal in proof, they deal in evidence. So for example, science is a method that utilizes observation and measurement to come to conclusions about the natural world and the universe. Science will then use logic to analyze those observations and evaluate the evidence. But here's the kicker. Science doesn't actually prove anything. Nope. Instead, it just draws logical conclusions from the evidence at hand, acknowledging a certain level of uncertainty about those conclusions. And guess what? History plays by those same rules. History uses evidence of what we observed that is left over from the past to come to conclusions about events from the past. And then, of course, history applies logic to analyze and evaluate that evidence. So what I'm doing in this video is I'm not providing proof, which doesn't work within historical claims. I am providing evidence. And I'm going to show that the best conclusion to draw from that evidence is that Jesus actually did raised from the dead. And the evidence that I'm going to actually present is actually evidence that most historians and scholars actually agree with. That might surprise you, but it's true. And you want to stick around to the end because I'm going to talk about how some of these scholars come to different conclusions based on the evidence and show why their conclusions are not the most reasonable conclusion to come to. So let's make our case. Evidence number 1. The first evidence that we have is that Jesus really existed and that he died by Roman crucifixion. Now, I hear you.
Just because Jesus existed and died doesn't mean he rose from the dead.
I agree with you. The evidence I am presenting is a collective cumulative case to show that ultimately Jesus rose from the dead, not that each individual piece of evidence in and of itself proves that Jesus rose from the dead. And it's kind of hard to rise from the dead if you don't exist, and hard to rise from the dead if you didn't die. So this is the first piece of evidence. Now, some of you watching, and a lot of the atheists I come across online, might be shocked when I say that we know that it is historical fact that Jesus existed, and even more so that there are facts we know about him, like he died by crucifixion. Mythicist thinking, which is the idea that Jesus was just a myth and didn't actually exist, is rampant online among atheists. Specifically, atheists who learn about Jesus from social media and TikTok. And unfortunately, positions that would be laughed at among scholars become popular on social media like TikTok and YouTube and others. But at the scholarly level, mythicists are looked at along the lines of Holocaust deniers or flat earthers. It's just not reasonable to believe that Jesus was a myth made up and didn't exist. Atheist historian Gerd Ludemann says that Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Another atheist historian and scholar, John Dominic Crossan, says there is not the slightest doubt about the fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. It is as sure as anything historical can be. Paula Fredrickson, a scholar and historian, said this: the single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around Passover in the manner Rome reserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion. E.P. Sanders said, Jesus being crucified is one of the almost indisputable facts about Jesus' life. And, of course, Barn Ehrman, an atheist biblical scholar, said that one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. So, we can clearly see that among atheist scholars, there's this consensus that Jesus did exist and that he did die by crucifixion. So, where do they get this? Well, let me give you some examples. Scholars and historians agree that Tiberius was the Roman emperor from 14 CE or AD to 37 CE or AD. The existence of Tiberius is attested to by 10 individuals. With Jesus, however, he is attested to by 40. And a large number of these sources speak of his crucifixion. And not all of these sources are Christian sources. Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Marabar Serapion, they all attest to Jesus and his death on the cross, and they are not Christian sources. So it is a verified fact of history that Jesus existed and died by Roman crucifixion. So let's talk about evidence number 2. Evidence number 2 is that Jesus had disciples and that they lost all hope and were despondent and in despair after the death of Jesus. Now, again, I understand that you think that may not be evidence for the resurrection. We're building to that, right? So his disciples encountering Jesus after he rose from the dead can't happen if he didn't have disciples. And the fact that they were in despair has something to say about their reaction after Jesus rose from the dead, which we'll look at in a few moments. It is historically agreed upon that Jesus was a rabbi in the first century who had disciples who followed him. John Muir, a biblical scholar, said, fortunately, we don't need to spend a great deal of time on the question of whether Jesus in fact had disciples during his lifetime, since the historicity of some such group is rarely ever denied. In the study of history, there's one key important historical tool that is used in historical analysis that needs to be introduced here: the criterion of embarrassment. The criteria of embarrassment is a type of historical analysis in which a historical account is deemed likely to be true under the inference that the author would have no reason to invent a historical account that would lend to embarrassment or might embarrass them. The criteria applies to the disciples in the inclusion of Judas Iscariot. If this tradition had its origin in the early Christian groups rather than in the historical life of Jesus, it would have been much less embarrassing to make Judas Iscariot an outsider. Or at least if he was a follower of Jesus, he would be one of the larger group and not the 12 disciples. So based on this indicates that based on historical analysis, he really did have disciples. We also have records from other historical sources pointing to the fact that he had followers. But what about them losing all hope? This is actually also agreed upon by scholars. So let's look at some of the evidence. Tacitus, who was a Roman historian and not sympathetic to the Christian cause, wrote this: a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace, Christus, it's the Roman name for Christ or Jesus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition thus checked for a moment, meaning that it was shut down for a moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. So Tacitus is saying that Christus, Christ, Jesus, was killed by crucifixion. And when that happened, the movement shut down for a moment. Temporarily, the movement was checked. There was a breakdown of it. But then, once again, all of a sudden it sprang up. This indicates to us that the disciples, when Jesus died, there was this breakdown of the movement for a moment. It's not like the moment he died, they started just running full steam ahead, proclaiming him to be the Messiah. Something happened with his death that caused them to go into mourning. They stopped, they were despondent, and then something happened that caused them to come out of that and the movement to take off. We also have the text of the Gospels themselves. Now, wait a minute. I hear you.
The Bible can't be a source. It's the Bible.
That claim is just not scholarly, nor is it an honest way of looking at history. To just discredit the Bible as an ancient source is to do nothing but reveal your own bias against the Bible. You don't have to believe the Bible is the inspired word of God or inerrant, nor do you have to believe the Bible is true in everything it says for you to recognize that the Bible is an ancient source and that it does tell us something about history, even if you think that it's got some things wrong. Because, newsflash, all historical records we look at have things wrong. Because no one expects historical documents to be 100% accurate in everything they say. So if you don't think the Bible is the inspired word of God, then just treat it like any other historical text, but don't dismiss it and say you can't use it, because that would be bias.
And no, the Bible claiming it is not evidence.
Outside of the Christian Bible, there are no accounts of Jesus' resurrection.
And what we see is that scholars don't do that. Biblical scholars, even atheists who don't believe what's in the Bible, use the Bible to understand things from history because it is an ancient document written in history. For example, Bart Ehrman, an atheist biblical scholar, says this: whatever one thinks of the Gospels as inspired scripture, they can be seen and used as significant historical sources. The Gospels can and should be treated as historical sources, no different from other historical sources infused with their authors' biases. Now, while I disagree with Ehrman on the infused with biases, because I'm a Christian and believe it is inerrant and actually God-breathed, the point remains the same, that you don't have to believe that and can still treat the Bible as a historical document. So when scholars use these texts, as all ancient Near East scholars do, they are not saying, because the Bible tells me so. They are analyzing them as historical sources. And it's also important to recognize the Bible is not just one source. And a lot of people misunderstand this because they view the Bible, oh, the Bible says that, well, that's one source. No, the Bible is multiple sources. The Gospels are multiple sources. You see, the Bible wasn't one text by one author at one time. It was multiple texts, and they had multiple authors and told about multiple different aspects, so it is not just one source. For example, the Gospels are not just one text. They are 4 distinct ancient documents by different authors written at different times. And while Luke and Matthew do appear to borrow from Mark, they are separate documents that include details that Mark doesn't include. So the 4 Gospels, on top of what we saw in Tacitus, is 4 more sources that clearly tell us the disciples lost all hope and that they were in despair. And the result of this generally is that the movement is ended. And this is what makes Tacitus so intriguing, because he says it checked the movement, it stopped it, but it was only for a moment. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the movement takes off again. There were other claims of being the Messiah in that time. We know from other historical sources there were people who claimed to be the Messiah. Eventually, they would be killed or die. And when that happens, all of their followers disperse. The movement doesn't go on. And 2,000 years later, we're not talking about them. But yet we still talk about Jesus, yet the movement did not end. And that's important to understand. It's different than all the other examples we have of that time. The fact that the disciples were in despair, despondent, this is accepted by most scholars because it meets the criteria of embarrassment. From the story of doubting Thomas, doubting Jesus' resurrection, to Peter denying Jesus 3 times right before, and then after he rose, he breaks down because of that denial, to them locking themselves in a room out of fear, to them saying, we're going fishing, we're done, we're just going back to our old life. All of these stories meet the criteria of embarrassment. Someone who was writing this later, coming up with this myth of Jesus rising from the dead, and this myth, they wouldn't include those type of details. They would write them as being people full of faith because they're the founders of the church. They would want to show them as the leaders, the people that show us what faith is like. It's a very important piece of evidence that they were in despair. Let's talk about evidence 3. Evidence 3 is that Jesus was indeed buried, and most likely buried in a private tomb. Now, I know, again, you're going to say,
Just because he was buried doesn't mean he rose again.
and I agree, just because he was buried isn't evidence that he actually rose from the dead. But he can't rise from the dead if he's not really dead, and showing that they buried him in a tomb does support and lend credence to the fact that he was actually dead. So what happens next after that, the fact that he was really dead and in a tomb, is very important. I'll talk about more evidence of this in a moment, but let's start with the Gospels. So the Gospels all speak of Jesus being buried in a tomb, and specifically in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus was buried, and this chapter is very, very important. It dates from before the time of the Gospels. Stick around, that chapter comes up very important in just a moment. So the Gospels mentioning that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea is deemed most likely to be true by most historians, for a couple of reasons. So the Gospels describe Joseph as a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. He's unlikely to be made up by the Gospel writers because he would have been well known in Jerusalem. He would have been well known amongst the people of Israel. The Sanhedrin was the 70 leading men of all of Israel and all of Judaism. It wouldn't be helpful for the Gospel writers writing within a generation of this stuff happening to make up the story about a specific Jewish leader that would have been well known and people would have known of him even at the time of the writing of the Gospels, because it could easily be denied by their Jewish opponents. You see, the Jews at the time wanted to stamp out Christianity. They didn't want Christianity to continue to grow. So they could have easily defeated the Gospel writers by showing this to be inaccurate if it was inaccurate when they wrote it. It also meets the criteria of embarrassment, because it would be embarrassing to the disciples that only a Jewish leader among the Sanhedrin, instead of the disciples themselves, was brave enough to go to Pilate and ask to bury Jesus. Hostility between the Sanhedrin and the early Christians was intense. It's unlikely that the writers of the Gospels would invent this to show that kind of embarrassing detail that the disciples were off hiding in fear while the Sanhedrin who had attacked Christianity was actually helping bury Jesus. So of course, this meets the criteria of embarrassment. Now, there's many people who argue against this, and they'll say,
Roman crucifixion victims were not allowed to be buried, so this is false. Or if they were buried, they were just thrown in the trash heap and weren't actually buried.
However, we have historical records showing that's not correct. Josephus says they, and the they is referring to the Idumeans, a group of foreigners that Josephus considers impious and evil. They actually went so far in their impiety as to cast out the dead bodies without burial. Although the Jews are so careful about burial rites that even malefactors or criminals who have been sentenced to crucifixion are taken down and buried before sunset. So Josephus indicates here that Jews were very careful about their burial rites, that even crucifixion victims would be taken down and buried. But why? Well, this comes from the Old Testament law. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 through 23, it says, "And if a man have committed a sin worthy of death, and he be put to death, and thou hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day, for he that is hanged is accursed of God, and that thy land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance." Josephus actually talks about this again in Apion, where he says, "However, there are other things which our legislator ordained for us beforehand, which of necessity we ought to do in common to all men, as to afford fire and water and food to such as want it, to show them the roads, nor to let anyone lie unburied. He also would have us to treat those that are esteemed our enemies with moderation." But even with this evidence, some have argued that it's just not accurate with what we know about Roman crucifixion. That is until 1968. In 1968, archaeologist Vasilos Zarveris, which I may have butchered that name, excavated a Jerusalem tomb that contained the bones of a crucified man, Yehohanan. The bones were found in an ossuary, which is a bone box, inscribed several times with his name. This ossuary, along with several others, had been placed in a tomb complex consisting of 2 chambers and 12 burial niches. So during the Roman period, Jews who could afford this type of burial would lay out the body of their dead loved ones on stone benches inside the tomb. These tombs would be cut out of rock. And about a year later, after the flesh had kind of decomposed, the bones would be collected and put into these little bone boxes, which would only be the length or size of a femur, because that's the longest bone in the body. All the other bones would be collected and put into the box. This evidence showed definitively that a Jewish man killed by Roman crucifixion was allowed to be buried. And it was someone of great wealth. So when you have someone of great wealth and influence, they were allowed to get the body and bury it. Only a few skeptical scholars debate this. Most agree that Jesus was buried. So evidence number 4. Evidence number 4 is that the tomb was found empty. Now, I'm going to say this is a fact that has the least amount of scholarly support. But when I say it has the least amount of scholarly support, what I mean by that is it has about 75% of scholars agree with this, which is still the majority of scholars. A good amount of the majority of scholars. That's based on a survey conducted by Gary Habermas, surveying the material written by scholars on the resurrection. Now, some will argue that Habermas is biased because Habermas is a Christian, although they would be ignoring the fact that Habermas was simply reporting the survey of what other scholars have said and believed, not his own views. But let's look at what skeptical scholar Jacob Kramer says on this topic. He says, by far, most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb. He's not saying that he agrees that Jesus rose from the dead. He's just saying that the tomb was indeed empty. Most scholars agree the tomb was empty. But because this is one of the evidences that have the least amount of agreement, let me give you 6 pieces of information that support it. 1, there are multiple attestations to it, which this is important in historical study. If you have one source that attests to something, it is less likely to be true than if you have multiple witnesses confirming this. So what are these sources? Well, number 1, you have the 4 Gospels, which that's 4 separate sources, not one source. You have the pre-Markan account, which is the idea that Mark included something that came from before him when he wrote his gospel. So even if you think Mark was written much later, he includes something within his text that seems to come from some other source that we just don't know what it is. And this is based on all kinds of different scholarly writings. You can study the pre-Markan account. But the section that comes from the pre-Markan account and mentions the empty tomb, and that's dated to around 37 AD. There's also the sermons in the book of Acts that talk about the empty tomb and Jesus being rose from the dead out of the tomb. Book of Acts is a separate source than the other Gospels. You also have the writings of Paul, which imply by logical necessity an empty tomb. Now, some will argue that Paul never mentions an empty tomb specifically, but his writings do demand one. As Bart Ehrman, an atheist scholar, said in his reply to a question about why Paul doesn't mention the empty tomb, he says this: my guess is that Paul does not talk about any traditions that indicated that women went to the tomb and found it empty because he had not heard of these traditions at the time he wrote. Paul certainly thought and would have said, if asked, that the tomb was empty, because he definitely thought Jesus was physically raised from the dead. That is his entire argument in 1 Corinthians 15. His Corinthian opponents maintained that the resurrection of believers was a past spiritual event, and they had already experienced it. Paul's purpose in 1 Corinthians is not, decidedly not, to argue that Jesus really was raised from the dead physically. That is the view that he accepts as obvious and agreed upon between himself and the Corinthians. I say this because some people have claimed that 1 Corinthians 15 is the chapter where Paul tries to prove Jesus' resurrection. That's not true at all. He uses the belief in Jesus' physical resurrection, a belief he shares with his readers, in order to argue a different point about their own resurrection. His point is that since Jesus' resurrection was a bodily resurrection, which the Corinthians agree on, then their own resurrection will as well be bodily, which means it is not simply spiritual. So Paul's entire point is that Jesus physically rose from the dead, and if that's the point, then it has to be an empty tomb out of logical necessity. So he does indeed, based on the way he argues, advocate for an empty tomb, even if he doesn't say the words empty tomb. And again, that's not coming from me, that's coming from an atheist who argues about Paul's writings. Another key historical tool in historical analysis is something called enemy attestation. If an enemy of the event or of the people attests to the fact that something happened, it becomes much more trustworthy in history because the enemy has no incentive to make it up. We have enemy attestation in Matthew chapter 28, where the priests and the elders of Israel claim that the disciples stole the body, which would attest to the fact the tomb was now empty. Now, I hear you.
But that is just Matthew claiming the enemy attested to this, but not actual writing from the enemy.
I get it. However, historians all generally agree that this would be enemy attestation. And they agree to this for multiple reasons. But one of those reasons is the fact that other sources attest to this rumor and that rumor was still persisting in their day. So there's a writing by a man named Justin Martyr who was having a debate with a man named Trypho. Now, I may be butchering that name. But this writing was him going back and forth with a Jew who was an enemy who disagreed with the resurrection of Jesus. And this is what the Jew who disagreed said. His disciples stole him by night from the tomb where he was laid when unfastened from the cross, and now deceive men by asserting that he has risen from the dead and ascended to heaven. Tertullian also mentions this rumor, and one like it, that it was the gardener who took the body of Jesus because he was afraid of people coming there and trampling his garden. When you couple that with the fact that when Matthew was written, they could have easily debunked the claim by simply producing the body of Jesus. Like, if they write that this is what the Jews are saying, well, at the time of the writing of Matthew, there would be people alive who would have been spreading these rumors who could have said, we never said that. We can get the body of Jesus and prove it. Now, I know some people date the writing of Matthew till after 70 AD and all of that, which that's another whole video that I'll make in the future. Subscribe if you haven't already so you can see that video about the dating of the Gospels. But the idea is that there would at least be, even if they couldn't get to Jerusalem because of the Great War to actually show Jesus' body, there would be people who would have heard that rumor being spread who could have said, no, we never said this. This is not our argument. So because of all those reasons, this is considered enemy attestation by historians. There's also no competing story from the first century. We have no record of anybody saying anything other than Jesus' body was stolen. So we have no records of them saying this Christian movement is running around saying that Jesus rose from the dead, but that's not true. His body's over here, or no, it was here. Like, we have no competing stories to show that Jesus wasn't raised from the dead. The only stories we have from anything is just the indication that the tomb was empty. We have no other stories at all that survived that have been spread around, which indicates that the tomb was likely empty. It was also women who first discovered the empty tomb according to the gospel narratives, which meets the criteria of embarrassment. Most historians agree that the empty tomb really happened because if you were going to create a narrative, you wouldn't say women were the ones who found the tomb. That would be embarrassing. Women were not looked at as valid witnesses, even in a court of law. They were not viewed as authoritative or valid, and that they're not to be believed. If your only witness against you is a woman, your case in a court of law at that time, you're probably going to have it dismissed because women were not seen as credible. So if someone was inventing this and it was legendary in development later, they wouldn't use women as the source of finding the empty tomb. They would use men. We already talked about Joseph of Arimathea, but in response to the empty tomb, the fact that Joseph of Arimathea is mentioned is important because he was well known in the area. It was testable. When this was being spread around, it would be testable that Joseph of Arimathea, whether he did or did not bury Jesus in that tomb and where that tomb was, it would be a knowable place. They could go to him. They could find out where's the tomb and see if Jesus' body is still there. So it would have been very easy to disprove if Joseph of Arimathea was made up and the tomb wasn't really empty. And also, again, Joseph of Arimathea meeting the criteria of embarrassment. We also know from archaeology that this type of tomb was prominent in Israel at that time. There were 3 different types of tombs in the time of Jesus. This was the most expensive kind, which would fit with it being the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin and a very wealthy man, according to scripture. The reason this is important is because if the claim is that there was an empty tomb and it describes this tomb, but then we knew from archaeology that this type of tomb didn't exist at that time, that would be disconfirming evidence. But the fact that it does exist and they knew it existed would have to show that they at least knew something about the region and the time period, and gives credence to the fact that Jesus really was buried in this type of tomb. So the tomb was empty. Evidence 5. The 5th piece of evidence is that the disciples had individual and group experiences that they believed were real encounters with a risen Jesus. This 5th piece of evidence is attested to by the vast majority of scholars. They all pretty much agree that the disciples had some kind of experience that they truly believed was them encountering Jesus as risen. Now, just because a scholar believes they had these experiences doesn't mean they agree that it was the actual resurrection. They just believe it was some kind of experience, and they all believed they had some kind of experience. Of course, we know that the Gospels and the book of Acts speak of these post-resurrection appearances, but there's also something much more interesting, and that is a creedal statement in the writings of Paul. Now, there's multiple creedal statements, and actually not just in Paul, but also in the Gospels, but the most important one is from Paul in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I already mentioned 1 Corinthians 15 earlier, talking about Bart Ehrman in the empty tomb. But what I didn't say is that 1 Corinthians 15 includes something that was actually not Paul's words. He quotes something that is very important to us. So let's read it. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. It says, "For I delivered unto you first of all that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen of Cephas," that's Peter, "then of the 12. After that, he was seen of above 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain until this present, but some are fallen asleep. After that, he was seen of James, and then of all the apostles." So this passage where it talks about all these appearances of Jesus, this is written in creedal form. A creed was a formal statement of belief that is passed down and agreed upon. Scholars all recognize this form in 1 Corinthians 15. There are a number of reasons scholars draw this conclusion from linguistic considerations. First, the words received, which is in Greek paralabon, again butchering these pronunciations, and delivered, which in Greek is paradoka, are Greek equivalents to the technical rabbinical terms kebel min and masar le, which are terms for the passing on of tradition. Scholar William F. Orr says, "Here the correlation with delivered in verse 3 points to a chain of tradition. Paul received the facts that he is relating from Christians who preceded him, and in turn, he delivered them to the people of his churches." 1 Corinthians 11 contains a similar example using the same words received and delivered. This indicates that 1 Corinthians 15 is not the only example of Paul using traditional materials in his epistles. Another example is the word hotai, again, butchering, being repeated 3 times, which is the word translated that, indicates a streamlined formulaic pattern of creedal information. Scholars noted that hotai or kai hotai, which is translated and that, functions as quotation marks to link all the sections together. If you removed those, the sentence would actually still make grammatical sense. So the addition of kai hotai would actually show the creedal formulation for the ancient times. There are other reasons that they determined this is a creed, but you get the point. This is a creedal formulation. It's something that was given to him, a formula of a creed that was given to him that he is repeating. 1 Corinthians was actually written, most scholars agree, between 50 to 55 AD, which is about 20 to 25 years after the time of Jesus. But this creed had to have time to take on creedal form and be passed down before Paul wrote the letter, which means before that it was already in circulation. But wait, there's more. Scholar Gerald O'Collins states that he knows of no scholar who dates the creed after the mid-40s. Now we're looking about 10 to 15 years of the time of Jesus' death. Gerd Ludemann, who's an atheist New Testament scholar, says, "The elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, no later than 3 years. The formation of the appearance traditions mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15 3-8 falls into the time between 30 and 33 CE or AD. Now we're talking within a couple of years of Jesus' death." Robert Funk, a non-Christian scholar, said the conviction that Jesus had risen from the dead had already taken root by the time Paul was converted, about 33 CE, on the assumption that Jesus died about 30 CE. The time for development was thus 2 or 3 years at most. But wait, there's more. James Dunn, a professor at Durham, says this: "Despite uncertainties about the extent of tradition which Paul received, there is no reason to doubt that this information was communicated to Paul as part of his introductory catechesis. He would have needed to be informed of precedents in order to make sense of what had happened to him. When he says, 'I handed on to you as of first importance what I also received,' he assuredly does not imply that the tradition became important to him only at some subsequent date. More likely, he indicates the importance of the tradition to himself from the start. That was why he made sure to pass it on to the Corinthians when they first believed. This tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as tradition within months of Jesus' death." So this creedal form took on this form within months of Jesus dying. Michael Goulder, who is an atheist New Testament professor, says this. It goes back to at least to what Paul was taught when he was converted, a couple of years after the crucifixion. So scholars agree this creed is extremely early. So in general, we can be sure this creed was formulated and circulating within a few months to just a couple of years after Jesus' death. And before the creed can be put into creedal form and circulated, it had to be something that was believed amongst Christians prior to that. So really, right from the get-go, right from the time Jesus died, within a few days, few weeks, and a couple of months, there was this belief that Jesus had risen from the dead and had appeared to Paul and to the 500 and to these others. This is important because it rules out this idea of legendary development. These post-resurrection experiences where they experienced the risen Jesus, these aren't something they came to that was legendary development years later, decades later. People started claiming that he rose from the dead. No, this was immediate at a time in Jerusalem, where they were preaching this in Jerusalem and believing this and spreading this in Jerusalem, where it could be tested, where the body of Jesus could be, shown if it really didn't happen, where all of these things right there could be tested very early on. This isn't legendary development. These experiences really did happen. Now, what those experiences were, that's what some people debate. Was it really the risen Jesus? Was it hallucination? That's what people debate. But it really did happen. There really was some kind of experience they had. Which brings us to evidence 6. The sixth piece of evidence is the disciples' lives were transformed, and they were willing to die for what they believed. Now, I'll be the first to admit that many Christians exaggerate what is actually known here. For most of the disciples, we do not have any historical records of their deaths, and what most people claim about their deaths just show up in much later traditions whose roots that we don't have anything substantive to show whether it's true or not. But as atheist scholar Bart Ehrman says, there are indications that Peter and Paul were martyred that come from the first century, from Clement. My view is that both of them did indeed die in Rome, possibly under Nero. There are hints in the New Testament that John and James were also killed, but we do not know the full circumstances. Early on, there is nothing about the death of the others, Andrew, Matthew, Bartholomew, Judas not Iscariot, and so on. We also know from Josephus that the brother of Jesus, James, was killed for his faith. So even acknowledging that we don't know about all of the disciples, we do know about some of them and that they were willing to die for their faith. And while we don't know every detail about all the others, we do know from historical sources that the Christians were persecuted early on. We know that the Jews and the Romans wanted to stop Christianity in its infancy. So as Christianity began to spread, at the time the disciples would have been alive, there was persecution and attack on the church. So we know we had the potential for death. And even though they may not have died, we don't know the full details of their death, we do know that they believed and spread and preached this message under threat of death, which means they were willing to die for their belief. And most people are not willing to die for a lie. There's very few people where you're going to get that many people willing to die for something they know is a lie that they made up. They had some kind of experience that convinced them this happened, that they weren't dying for a lie. And then the final evidence, evidence 7. James, the brother of Jesus, was a skeptic before Jesus died. All scholars agree with this. But all of a sudden, he agrees that Jesus rose from the dead and starts worshiping Jesus and is willing to die for Jesus, as we find out in Josephus. We also know that a few years after the death of Jesus, Saul gets converted, we call him Paul, and he had persecuted the church. He was against the church, and yet he had some kind of experience that he believed, caused him to believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus, that he went from persecuting the church and killing Christians to actually being the primary apostle preaching the gospel to the Gentiles. And we even have atheists, to give you an example, atheist Gerd Ludemann, the historian atheist, he attributes the conversion of James to his resurrection appearance or his experience with the resurrected Jesus, according to 1 Corinthians 15. Now, he's not saying that Jesus actually rose from the dead. He's just saying James had some kind of experience that led him to believe that. So this kind of goes against the issue of, well, Maybe they had hallucinations because of their grief. Well, Paul and James weren't mourning the death of Jesus. And even if James was mourning the death because it was his brother, but not mourning, he didn't believe he was God. He didn't believe he was the Messiah. So he would have no reason to hallucinate Jesus coming back from the dead as Messiah and then worshiping him. It just doesn't make sense. So there are various things that people use to try to understand all of these pieces of evidence. There are arguments like it's just legend, but that doesn't really fit because the early belief, these disciples actually preaching this and believing this very early on within a few months of Jesus' death, isn't enough time for legendary development. And not only is it not enough time for legendary development, it could have been easily disproven right then and there by producing the body of Jesus, which didn't happen. So his body clearly was missing. And then that leads to, okay, well, maybe the disciples did steal the body, which doesn't make sense because how would they do that? There were guards outside the tomb. Very unlikely they would be able to get past those guards to steal the body. They would then be, if they stole the body, believing that it was truly a lie. They would know this is a lie, and yet they were still willing to die for it, which doesn't make any sense. There are no theories. There's even something called the swoon theory where Jesus didn't really die and he got up from the grave because he was almost to the point of death, but then after 3 days in the tomb, he kind of revived and started feeling better and was able to come out, which is not correct based on the way Romans did crucifixion. Romans knew how to make sure the person was dead. We see these throughout history. They knew how to check to see if the person was dead. Number two, if you're on the point of death and you have no medical care and you're laying in a cold, damp, dark tomb, you're not going to just suddenly get better in 3 days. And not only that, how is he going to get out? How is he actually going to come out of the tomb? He's going to get past the guards. He's going to be able to roll the stone away from the inside. How does that work? None of these theories fit with the evidence. So the question becomes, what is the best conclusion based on this evidence? No one in thousands of years has been able to produce an argument or a theory that explains the evidence to show that Jesus did not rise from the dead. The resurrection is the only theory that actually fits as the best conclusion based on the evidence. Now remember, proof versus evidence. The way we do history is we come to what's the most likely conclusion based on the evidence. Now, here's the thing. If you say the resurrection cannot be the most likely conclusion because people just don't raise from the dead, then you are coming to it with a preconceived bias. You are saying that this is impossible to happen just because you don't think it can happen, so it can't be the explanation, and you're ruling out a potential explanation for the evidence that fits with all the evidence just because you have a bias that it cannot happen. But the truth is, if God is real, then it is very easy to explain this happening. God, who created the universe and creates life, would have the ability to raise Jesus from the dead. So unless you have evidence that it is impossible for resurrections to happen, you cannot discredit this as being a candidate explanation. And until you can provide evidence of any other explanation that would fit with all the evidence, you cannot say that this is not the most likely conclusion based on the evidence. I hope this has helped you. Comment down below. What are your thoughts on the evidence? If you're an atheist watching this, do you have another explanation for all of this evidence? I'd love to hear it down below, and I'll talk to you next time.